Welcome to the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeons podcast. I'm your host, Peter Chalmers, a shoulder and elbow surgeon at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Rachel Frank, a sports and shoulder surgeon at the University of Colorado in Denver. Rachel, how are you?
Pete, I'm doing great, thanks. How are you tonight?
Oh, I'm doing good. Before we get started, I should mention the views expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views of the American Shoulder and Elbow Surgeon Society, the University of Utah, the Wake Forest University, the institutions of any of our guests. So today we have a little bit of a bittersweet announcement that I'm going to turn over to Rachel to make.
Well, thanks, Pete. I want to thank you and thank the ASES for hosting this podcast for so long. The bittersweet part of this today comes into the fact that I'm going to be stepping down from my roles as co-host of the podcast. And we're bringing in some amazing, fresh, excellent talent. Everyone knows who this guy is, but we will introduce him anyway. We have the Dr. Brian Waterman, and he's a special guy for me, similar to Pete, where I trained alongside Pete at Rush for residency. I was fortunate enough to train alongside Brian Waterman at Rush for fellowship. Brian, why don't you say hello and introduce yourself?
Yeah, Rachel, great to be here and great to be able to share the stage that you've really helped to establish. You and Peter have done excellent work with the podcast, and I look forward to carrying on that legacy and hopefully exploring some new topics for our membership.
Thanks, Brian. For me, I think that this is a perfect time in the history of the ASES podcast to bring in some new talent, new thoughts, keep the podcast fresh, keep it vibrant, keep up with what's the latest and greatest in shoulder and elbow surgery. And there's none better than Pete Chalmers to continue with this and Brian Waterman to bring in those fresh ideas alongside Pete. It's been a true honor for me to be part of it for the last several years. Getting going really just before the COVID pandemic and carrying it on through to this point. And I look forward to seeing the future of the podcast.
Well, I think from my perspective, Rach, it's been, an incredible honor to work together. You've had so many phenomenal ideas, and you've brought such energy and purpose to the podcast and such balance. I mean, it's, again, I could not have asked for a better co-host. And I have known that from the beginning, having worked with you together a long time ago as residents. And I'm sad to see you leave, but I also think that, we have Brian Waterman coming in, so I'm excited about that. So that's the bittersweet part of it for me. I think for the listeners, it's just difficult to underestimate the amount of work that's gone into this. I mean, we've spent literally days together recording this, in addition to the days offline we spent coordinating. I mean, it's got to be 10,000 emails by now. So I appreciate your constant patience with me and, all the work and energy you brought to this. And the ASES is really fortunate to have had you make the contribution you've made to this podcast.
Well, thanks, Pete. It's certainly been a lot of fun over the years. And yeah, for our listeners, the amount of work that goes in behind the scenes is difficult. So Brian, welcome to that. But you'll manage it well, like you do with everything else. And of course, Pete's a superstar, and it's been incredibly just fun. And I feel very fortunate to have gotten to do this over the last several years.
Well, Rach, take us down a little walk down memory lane. I mean, again, we've had three years, 3 days of content in total lined up end to end. What's your favorite memory or favorite thing about the podcast? And it could be something that was recorded or something even that happened, like offline. As you know, we often have conversations before and after we record that I wish that we could put in because they're often so authentic. But tell me your favorite memory.
Yeah, there's just too many to go through. I think for me, the best part about this podcast is getting to work with you, Pete. That's been amazing. And I think equally amazing is getting to talk to the people that we've gotten the opportunity to talk to. Certain episodes come to mind when we honored, Dr. Rockwood, and we got to personally interview Drs. Burkhead and Matson and Bigliani and Williams and Schofield. These are the mentors of our mentors. And to be able to spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, even an hour in some cases, chatting with legends of shoulder surgery and sports medicine surgery, I don't know that there's any other area or any other opportunity, and at least in my life, where I would get to do that. And you're right, the offline conversations where we're talking either before or after the podcast, some of my most favorite parts. You talk about cases, you talk about life, you talk about things that As Pete said, we can't necessarily just put on the air for everyone. But it's amazing because you get to know these legends as people, and you get to hear a little bit about their life and their families and learn a little bit more about them. And they've all influenced us and our mentors so much. And to get to chat with them for a dedicated period of time, it's absolutely incredible. So I think just the people that we get to interact with through this podcast, one of my favorite things. I think another thing, we just had our shoulder elbow fellowship interviews at the University of Colorado, and the number of applicants that come up and say, "Oh my gosh, I listened to your podcast. I didn't know that was you." We're really influencing for better or for worse, hopefully for better, the next generation of shoulder and elbow surgeons. And the podcast is growing in popularity. And I think that part of this is awesome. You get to influence and hopefully have a meaningful impact on that next generation of docs. And so those two things, I think, for me have been really memorable.
Maybe I could share my number one favorite memory of something that you orchestrated for us on this podcast is we had an episode where we wanted to get Giovanni DiGiacomo on, and we had a lot of difficulty coordinating, both because of the time change and because Dr. Giacomo is, a very well-known, busy guy. So we managed to coordinate a time, and you said, okay, he's free for this 20-minute period. And I said, great, we'll make it work. And we started recording, and he wasn't on. And I remember we were chatting, you and I, before we started recording, and you were like, well, he'll be here. He's just got a constrained schedule. And he came on kind of midway through, and we discovered the reason why was because he was sitting in the locker room between matches after covering Rafa Nadal. And I was like, Rach, how did you arrange this? This is amazing.
It's unbelievable. I remember that very vividly. And he just all of a sudden came on, and we're like, okay, we're going to roll with this because that's what we do. And that's exactly right. What a great memory. And that's the caliber of guests that we've had, and they lead busy lives and they're doing busy things. And yet they're willing to take time to spend with us and to share their life and experiences with the ASES. So that was a super cool episode. I also really, really loved all of our episodes on kind of the softer topics, so to speak, the less content heavy topics, but the topics where we could literally see the cases that people were talking about. And those are the complications episodes. Those ones where someone's describing an x-ray or a patient presentation, and you can literally see that x-ray and you're probably vomiting a little bit by thinking about it. And yet we never had an x-ray to look at. It's just how vividly our guests were able to describe some of these complications, in particular the elbow ones, which made me glad that I don't do, elbow replacements or those kinds of surgeries when thinking about some of the complications. But yeah, we've had some great memorable episodes over the years for sure.
Rich, you're leaving us, unfortunately, but we've always valued your opinion as to where to go in the future. Where do you wish the podcast would go in the future? Or maybe what advice would you give Brian about how he should be pushing me in the future?
Well, I think you and Brian are going to tag team phenomenally well, and this podcast will definitely be in a better place moving forward than where it is now. And that's no knock on Pete. That's all just changing me over to Brian. I think it'll be wonderful for the podcast. I think advice that I would have is just remember that your listeners are listeners from all walks of life. They may be students interested in shoulder surgery. They may be sports med docs like myself and Brian, who also do other work around the body and take care of athletes. We do knee surgery and other surgeries as well. And so you want to speak to the listener who's not just a reverse revision shoulder arthroplasty surgeon, but you want to keep your audience in mind. And I would keep bringing both the very specific content heavy topics. We did one on infection, or we do one on a management for recurrent anterior instability. And those are great because those are what people want to hear. But don't forget to bring up the things that really influence practice: social media, private equity. If another worldwide pandemic hopefully never happens again, but if COVID happens, how that, or something similar to COVID, how that impacts our practice on the day-to-day. I think those topics are just as important as the shoulder and elbow specific topics, because those topics really impact our listeners' practice on the day-to-day. And I think those have been some of our most popular topics. So I would just encourage the two of you to keep doing what we've been doing, but keeping the audience in mind. And I think this podcast will continue to get better and better moving forward.
Hey, Rachel.
Um,
You've done such a great job of bringing in, I think, some of the softer topics you mentioned, but I also wouldn't under count the number of cerebral topics you've engaged on. I really have found that you can take a deep dive into sometimes what we think of as an esoteric topic, but bring it to life and call attention to the areas where we need to explore further. Is there one specific episode that you found you learned a ton from outside of, say, the professional development or practice management side?
Well, I think from the content heavy topics, I really did enjoy actually one of our more recent ones looking at augmentation for rotator cuff repair and hearing different perspectives on that. I kind of do what I do, and the conferences I go to influence me in one way versus another. But I try to read the literature and stay up to date on different topics or different techniques for augmentation of cuffs. And hearing our different speakers on their perspectives on this was really nice. I really enjoyed that. I think I could go on about any number of these. I think one of the series of episodes that I really liked was Pete's kind of series on his traveling fellowship. This was a number of episodes that he did on his own, but interviewing people that he met during his traveling fellowship and just getting their worldwide global perspective on a variety of topics, shoulder and elbow focused. So, I feel like I could find something I loved about each of the episodes that I've participated in and the ones that Pete's done on his own. But I would say, yeah, you're totally right. Getting into the weeds on a specific topic, you kind of learn more than I think we even thought possible, and that's due to the quality and experience of the guests that we typically have on. So yeah, I think I would say more recently, and maybe it's just fresh in my mind, the cuff augmentation one. But so many of these are incredibly insightful. We did one on the painful reverse total shoulder arthroplasty. That was probably 40 or so episodes ago. And that one was incredible just to hear, everyone experiences these patients and none of us really know what to do beyond the basics, the basic workup for infection, component position, it's that loosening, et cetera. And when all that's right, when all those seem okay, what we do with those patients. So it was great to hear our guest perspective on that particular topic as well, as that's a uncommon but challenging patient population that we all deal with. What about you, Brian? What have been some of your favorite episodes just as a fan of the podcast and moving into this role of co-host? What have you liked most?
I think it's really good when you're able to dig in on other individuals' practice and kind of tinker under the hood and see how they've created themselves for efficiency or for greater surgical excellence. One of the ones that I listened to relatively recently was the one with Jeff Dugas on practice management, and certainly gives us a lot to strive for in terms of life goals, practice goals. But his underlying tenet about being a yes person and accommodating the patient, even in the midst of taking care of a lot of these professional and fairly high demand athletes. I thought that was a real salient message from somebody that really has risen to a considerable level.
Pete, what have been your favorite episodes over the years?
I'm going to mention this when we talk with Joaquin, but my favorites were Romeo and Yamaguchi, just given how well I know them and the contributions they've made to my own career. I think another, and you mentioned this in our 100 episode, I thought that private equity episode was really, really interesting. And to me, the thing that hopefully we can do in the podcast that we can't do in a meeting is really get in the complexity of something that isn't a traditional content topic. So like that one was great. I thought that our feedback episode was super great. I honestly, and a lot of those have been your ideas, Rach. So I'm hoping Brian will have as many good ideas for episodes as you did, and we're gonna have to press forward without you, unfortunately. There.
Well, you're going to do a great job. I can't wait to continue to listen to the podcast now as a fan. And I think this podcast, again, it's going to be so much stronger moving forward. And it's already great right now. So I want to thank you, Pete, in particular, for dealing with me over the last few years, working through our scheduling differences and what works for both of us to get these guests on. And you're right, sometimes having to go at odd hours to accommodate our international guests. I think you and Brian are going to make an amazing duo. I could not think of anyone better to take this over from my part than Brian. And I think the podcast is in great hands moving forward. I'm super excited to see where this goes.
Well, again, I think from the perspective of the ASES, we all, again, owe you huge thanks for your contributions to the podcast, which are innumerable, and it's just so many hours it's impossible to count. Hopefully, at some point we can have you back on as a guest, and I hope you'll continue to listen and stay in touch and tell me when I'm not doing it right at the very least. But unfortunately, this will be, I think, our last episode with you as host. So next time you come back, you can come back as a guest, which will be probably a lot more fun.
I think it'll be great moving forward. I think for the last time, we'll do our outro. That is all the time we have for today's podcast. I want to thank Brian Waterman for jumping on and joining in. Thank you, Pete Chalmers, for everything that you do. And thank you so much to all of our listeners out there. And for all our shoulder and elbow listeners out there, please don't forget to subscribe. And for Pete Chalmers, Brian Waterman, I'm Rachel Frank, and I'll see you next time.